And as you know, every Wednesday on the show, we have, I don't know if we should keep with this name now, Apologetic Tom. I'm not so happy with it as I was before we brought him on, but never mind. Today, we're talking about, this is a real difficult question. Now, I guess, as questions go, is this the one that you apologists, you find the most difficult to answer? Is it the one that there's many different opinions on it?
Yeah, this is the question of suffering is I think the most testing and the most difficult, not only question for somebody to answer, but it's also probably it's the most challenging thing we face as human beings, I think.
And I guess because it's so personal. So you think about people's own experiences of, and I used this earlier on the show, of those people who have been Christians, they've been believers their whole life, and they're told that they've got cancer. And everybody in the church is praying for them, and then that person dies. You hear about people who have lost young children, young innocent children. And then you think about the wars that have gone on in the past and the dreadful things that have happened in mankind. So the question today, Tom, is how can anybody believe in a good God when there's so much suffering and evil in the world?
How belief in a good God can continue while suffering occurs, particularly the gratuitous sort of multiple types of suffering, such as that inflicted through warfare, pandemics, genocide, is a fair question. It's not, however, primarily a matter of philosophical or intellectual speculation and discussion. We actually ask this question personally. So as we talk about this, it's okay to find this a little bit triggering, perhaps, or a little bit, this might make you a bit gutsy this morning as you think about it. We all cry sometimes. An explanation here would be actually a good start, a good thing to have. Why is it happening? Why is it going on? Where did it come from? But even better actually would be a solution, an answer. I'm sorry to say that I don't think that we have an explanation, a full explanation, but I do think we have a solution. I do think we have an answer. We need a way out of this pain. We also need an answer that can comfort us in those moments in empty hospital corridors, late at night, when we feel flattened, when we cry in the car, when nobody's watching, when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel alone, and we feel a bit helpless. So the general causes of suffering are identified in the oldest stories in the Bible as being the result of human beings and creatures turning away from God. And as a result of this, the world becomes not as God wants it. It becomes broken and disconnected from the source of life. And our own natures, our own human natures, become fragmented, alienated, and broken or fallen. And this is why we see human beings in the world with two natures: the light side that's glimpsed in the bravery of a president who refuses rescue, stays in his city and stands up to an invader with his people. And then the dark side of human nature, as we witness poisonings, murderings, ragings, abuse, and the way that human beings hurt each other. I want to reflect on something here briefly by posing this question. When we say suffering is wrong and that God, if good, should do something about it, and when we also make ethical judgments about some kinds of human conduct, we are actually referencing an ethical or a moral dimension, or a moral realm. This is when we appeal to that and we use that language of right and wrong, should and ought. If we are, though, referring to a moral reality, an ethical reality, a principle or principles of justice or goodness, which somehow operate independently from our feelings, our instincts, and our cultures, then we need to admit that we actually do live in a universe that seems to be moral. It seems to have moral characteristics, which itself may raise questions and hopes. C.S. Lewis himself came to a similar view. He said this: "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" Suffering shows us that there's something wrong with the world. Something has happened. Things are not right. The world and human beings have become cut off or alienated from the source of life, God. Now, anybody who cares about the pain of others and hears about a potential solution to this situation, this state of alienation, a way to be reconnected to the source of life and light, anyone who hears of such a thing, any possibility or promise of a solution, ought to investigate if they care about the problem of suffering. They ought to investigate this potential offer to reconnect with the source of life. My faith describes how suffering is real, but on the other side, God himself simultaneously justifies life by living it himself, but also confronts suffering and our state of alienation from God, from the creation, from each other, from ourselves, by himself going to give up his life to death on a cross. The cross is where we see God looking the beast of suffering in the eye and putting it down hard. This was the divine victory, the divine overcoming that delivered perfect justice and perfect love in one moment. 3 days later, it also became the victory of the Christ over death, over hopelessness, over shadow, like the returning of Gandalf at the moment where they most needed him. At times in my life, I have experienced violence, abuse, betrayal, and grief. And there will be many listening who have seen far, far worse than I have. And even today, there may be some carrying the weight of a struggle, alone and without hope of rescue. Our greatest need in these moments of isolation and hopelessness are not clever answers from a philosopher, but help, genuine love and care. God and the community or family all have roles to play here. But let me finish by just describing a way in which we can open the door to God here, to reconnect with him and to let him into our own tears. The people who are the most help to us when we feel alone are those who have been there themselves firsthand. They understand when words don't come easily. Because Jesus himself went through the most extreme isolation on the cross, he can come to us and he can know how we feel. He can sympathize, he can communicate with us. And through his own experience and wounds, he can uniquely come into our own pain, be with us in our pain, help us process it as we need to. And then he can lift us up slowly but surely and place our hope on the solid foundation of his resurrection from the dead. You see, the resurrection is the final word on suffering. It's the final word on the subject of hopelessness and aloneness. When he came back from the dead, and he really did, he showed us what true hope, a real love, and deep goodness really is.
Thanks very much, Tom. And it is one of those challenging questions because, like Tom said, we've all had devastating times. We've all lost people. In fact, a message that came in And this could be, we don't like to go too spiritual on these things, but this could be God working through the airwaves right now. And you mentioned about how our own experiences, they can go on to minister to other people. Well, that's exactly the message that we've just got from Sarah. And it reads, "Hi, Gareth and Tom. I lost my brother 24 years ago yesterday, and I often didn't understand why God let this happen. A few things that I have learned, though, in this time is that it's not always God who's in control. Sometimes it's the devil. God reveals good from these situations. And I've been able to use my experiences to support others at a point of suicide and others through those losses that they've experienced. And I feel blessed that God has trusted me with the gift to support others." It's a powerful thing, isn't it? And we can... we can look at these moments and, we're not trivializing this at all because, for those who have lost somebody so close like a brother or a baby and a child, there's nothing that we can say now apart from we're with you, we're praying for you, and we're trying our best to understand what we're going through. But, we may never understand what that feels like. But in a few years, in however long it takes, you may well look back like Sarah has, and you'll be able to say, actually, I'm not over it. I'll never get over it, but I've managed to learn from that experience and I can go on to minister to other people. And, there's a friend of mine, actually, and he suffered with addictions his whole life. But he can minister to those people at the moment who are where he was 10 years ago. And he can say, look, I've been there and it does get better. Now, if me or Tom was to try that, they'd say, hold on a minute. You don't know what this feels like. You're in Oxford. You're mixing with these clever people. And Gareth, you've got this job here. You've got a wife and kids and you haven't had to suffer with addiction. And that's fair enough to say. But those sometimes God puts in those positions and he says, actually, yeah, you're suffering at the moment. I'm with you. I'm actually there walking it with you. And what springs to mind here is that incredible poem. Have you heard it? Footprints in the Sand, Tom.
Tell me.
So this basically is where it's a person who's grieving and they're suffering and they pray to God and say, why is it, God, that when I was good, when I was fine, there was two pairs of footprints there in the sand. You were walking with me. And why is it through my grieving, it felt as though you weren't there and there was almost only my footprints? And then the author says that that's because God was carrying you on his back. And that, to me, have a look. Now, I've not done that justice at all, that poem. It's so much better than I just explained it, but have a look. It's called Footprints in the Sand. And for me, that is something I always go back to, that we don't have a God who just, he's up in the clouds floating. He's going, oh, Gareth's having a bad day. Tom's having a bad day. And Sarah's grieving her brother. He actually comes down and he ministers with us and he takes that suffering on. So thanks for sharing that, Sarah. And, I think we've just shared a moment here, folks. I think we really have. So thank you very much, Tom, for all you've brought to the conversations. And, it's so great that you are marvelous listeners. You share these stories with us because it does hit home as a broadcaster and a contributor. It does hit home that what this is all about. So thank you, everyone.